Hello everyone, welcome back to an episode of Incorrect Politics. Today we are going to discuss the Supreme Court packing, which is currently pushed heavily by the Democrats and heavily refuted by Republicans. So before we begin, since some of you may not be so familiar with the Supreme Court issue, and since this is the first time that I've covered this precise topic on my channel, I'm going to give you a very brief depiction of what the entire Supreme Court is and what's the central argument revolving around it. So the current Supreme Court has 9 justices, and the Supreme Court itself is the highest level on the judiciary level inside the United States. And among 9 justices, they will hear the case together and rule based on the majority. So basically, if 5 justices believes that one side wins the case, then the entire case will be determined to be won by that side which has 5 or more justices support. So from that case, you can see that John Roberts, he's a Chief Justice of the entire Supreme Court. However, that doesn't give him any extra voting right. He only still has 1 vote. So the ultimate goal is to have more justices that will vote in your favor instead of the justices that's going to vote against it. And because these justices are heavily separated between 2 ideologies, and these 2 ideologies were heavily correlated with 2 different parties, which is obviously Republicans and Democrats. So whether to fight for the seat of justices become a very important issue. And the United States Supreme Court justices is a lifelong position, meaning that if you are nominated and you choose not to step down or retire, or you're deaf, you will become a justice for your lifetime. That is why there is a 82 years old Associate Justice Stephen Breyer, and there is a much younger Amy Coney Barrett, which is only age 49. It could range from a wide variety of ages, and once being nominated, they will stand on the bench for many years to come. So one of the arguments you might heard is the Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Justice Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, which has happened recently in President Trump's era. And the reason why these 2 different nominations were heavily watched is because they each indicate a sweep inside the power composition of the United States Supreme Court. So there are 2 types of different Supreme Court justices. The one is the originalist. So the originalist justices are usually nominated by the Republican president. Their central belief is that what's written on the Constitution should be interpreted as it was originally intended. For example, the Constitution did state that every human being has equal rights, and they listed a certain amount of rights. So by that standard, these rights, such as the right to live and other kinds of basic rights, are protected. However, the newly evolved right has to be discussed and shouldn't be ruled based on the Constitution. For example, the right to abortion itself is not written in the Constitution, and people don't believe that the rights should be expanded according to the era, and the only way to protect these extra additional rights is by amending the Constitution. So these kind of justices, currently we have 6 of them by name. Mr. John Roberts, he's nominated by President Bush. He's an originalist, but recently he has become more of a centrist in terms of the Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas, nominated by another Bush, which is the older Bush you can see from the year 1991. It was the era of George Herbert Walker Bush. And Mr. Stephen Breyer is not an originalist. He was nominated by Clinton. And Samuel Alito was nominated by Bush. Sonia Sotomayor is nominated by Barack Obama. Elena Kagan is also nominated by Obama. Neil Gorsuch was nominated by Trump. Brett Kavanaugh by Trump, Amy Coney Barrett by Trump. So Amy, Brett, Neil, they were all originalists, as well as Clarence Thomas, which is also an originalist, and Mr. John Roberts, originalist by name. Samuel Alito is also originalist. In contrast, Mr. Stephen Breyer, Mr. Sonia Sotomayor, Mr. Elena Kagan, and Mr. Well, there was supposed to be 1. Yes, there's 3 of them. They are the staunch type of the judge who believes that their laws could be interpreted differently, and it should be interpreted differently according to the evolvement of the society. So that's a sharp comparison from the originalists, because they believe that we can interpret it based on what's supposed to be reasonable instead of has to strictly stick to the words. And these judges were usually nominated by the Democrats. And surprisingly enough, although the original differences between these justices were their belief on whether the Constitution should be rightfully interpreted or should be interpreted based on the society, but they also separated into very different places. For example, the originalist tends to be conservative justice, and they are more likely to rule in favor of conservative cases, such as, for example, in the 2000 Florida recount, which the Bush won the entire Florida and the 25 electoral votes and the entire presidency by only 530 votes. It was ruled by a 5-4 favor to the conservative side, and the 5 justices which voted for President Bush is conservative justices nominated by previous Republicans, and the 4 justices that voted against the closing of recount were nominated by Democratic presidents, and they were more tends to be a liberal justices. It's just a reality. So owing to this nature of justices, people will start to saying that these justices are partisan. They are not completely neutral. Although the Constitution and the Founding Father initially expected that these justices to be non-partisan and to basically rule according to the law. But even if for the approach to rule according to the law were sharply divided, so obviously you can't actually persuade anyone that the Supreme Court itself is completely out of politics. Just in fact that these justices always tends to make similar decisions based on their ideology. So right now, the Democrats are crying about, because I have just pointed out, excluding John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, they were all conservative justices, and the reliable liberal justices were only Mr. Stephen, Mr. Sonia, and Mr. Elena Kagan. And adding on to John Roberts, which is also nominated by Bush, the liberals says that the conservative currently holds a 6-3 majority, and they believe that the only way to regain the so-called majority is by expanding the courts, because the only way to replace the justices is justice itself to retire, or justices choose to step down. Sorry, justices, that's the same thing, right? So the justices died or justices start to retire. But currently there's no sign of any of them to retire, aside from the recently death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which was replaced by another conservative justice by Trump just in time. So Democrats says that, well, then let's expand the court. Since we have a 3 to 6 deficit, then let's expand the seats of the Supreme Court to 13 seats, then it will be a 7-6 majority for the liberal justices. Well, first of all, I believe that it's very not so smart to expand the seat to exactly 13, because that's just one extra for liberal. It makes the entire intention so utterly clear that your point is to grab the power because you believe that Supreme Court justices were not ruling in your favor. So what exactly did the Americans stand for on this sense? Well, before we look into that, let's look at the very word by the justice itself inside the system, and it's not from a conservative justice, it's from a liberal justice, Mr. Stephen Breyer. So from this Washington Post article, it says that Justice Breyer warns proponents of packing Supreme Court to think long and hard about the risks. However, although this is clearly an opinion against expanding the Supreme Court, the Democrats were started crying out. A lot of Democrats are now crying for Breyer to retire because they believe that Breyer opposing the court packing law, and anyone opposing the Democrats were bad people. For example, a few months ago, Mr. Feinstein, a senator from California, she's a Democrat obviously, during the hearing of Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, Senator Lindsey Graham, which is a Republican senator from South Carolina, just embraced, means literally hugged, Feinstein for showing a sense of friendship. However, just that friendship behavior, the Democrats believe that's a traitor sign of Mrs. Feinstein, because Mr. Feinstein were not supposed to embrace the enemy, and they now called Mr. Feinstein to resign from the Senate. So that's how the Democrats were so illusion to the left. Well, obviously not all the Democrats, but some of the Democrats, they just can't tolerate any people who has different opinion than them. And this is just one instance. Mr. Breyer, their very own liberal justices, now speak against packing the court, and they were crying out. And however, is the Democrat the majority of this opinion inside the entire United States? Well, clearly not. If you look into polls, let's look at this. It's a Fox News article, but it doesn't matter because the polling difference was too huge to claim that it's an effort by Fox News. So look at this. It says that 58% of likely voters questioned in New York Times poll said that Democrats should not expand the Supreme Court beyond its current 9 justices, with only 31% support the increase of size. That's a difference of more than 25%. And you can't really say that this is even about evenly supported issue, just like a lot of things inside the currently sharply divided partisanship. It's like the conscience of part of the Democrats were also going against this, because look at the numbers below. Democrats backing court expansion by a 57% to 28% margin. Look at this number, 57 to 28%. Even a quarter of the Democrats against these kind of behavior, because that's actually an attack on the judiciary system. And Republicans were overwhelmingly opposed by an 89% to 6% margin. That's a non-comparison between a 57% to 28% to a 89% to 6%. And look at the independents. 65% of independents go against packing the court. And if you just look down to all the different polls contained inside the Fox News and the ABC News Washington Post, 54% of Americans oppose comparison to 32%. And a lot more polls conducted in this side, 41% oppose the idea and 39% favor the move. And a lot of the polls were indicating that Americans were not in supportive of this entire behavior. And people from the left and the people of the Democratic Party were still acting as if the only way to achieve social justice was to nominate a new Supreme Court justices. Is that really the case? Well, I certainly do not believe so. And the Democrat says that this entire thing of expanding the court in favor of a certain ruling party is not an unprecedented move. And they often point to Mr. Roosevelt, which is a president from the World War II era, during which he tried to push the so-called New Deal and tried to revive the economy. So this was the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill of 1937, but rather proposed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, which is, interestingly enough, a Democrat again. So at that time there's 9 justices, and because these 9 justices were rapidly and oftenly blocking the proposed deal, so-called New Deal, because there's a New Deal, there's supposed to be a lot of different deals achieved by President Roosevelt. So Roosevelt got so frustrated and he proposed a bill to add more justices so that the Supreme Court will rule in his favor. However, that one was heavily rebutted. You may find it, because there's a lot of words inside, I'm not trying to find, let's see if I can, consequences. So I can't find the consequences, but you can already see from here, death of Robinson and defeat. So it's a defeat in the end of this entire judicial procedure reform. So yes, it is not unprecedented that Supreme Court was supposed to be 9 people, 9 justices, because yes, actually 150 years ago there used to be only 7 justices on the Supreme Court bench, and there used to be more than 9, more than 7. There used to be 11 and 13 justices on the Supreme Court, but that was back in the time, the 19th century. We're in the 21st century, and America itself is already a country that has more than 300 years of history. It's supposed to be much more stable. A lot of things were already although it's not written law, but it's already a given fact. And Supreme Court's integrity and itself's independency from the politics has to be maintained. Although currently we said that these justices were nominated by Republicans and Democrats, but at least their differences were based on their personal ideology. It's not because of they are taking the advantage from Republican, and for example, like a lot of senators, they're voting against their own state's will because they're a Republican or they're a Democrat. They have to vote in favor of Republican instead of, for example, a senator from Maine voted in favor of Maine. No, I'm not trying to portray Angus King or Susan Collins, but I'm just putting an example. Currently, the justices, although they interpret the law differently, but they're still interpreting the law and make their case based on the laws they believe. So at least that's still a good part of it. If we add more justices onto the Supreme Court bench, then we can no longer ensure this integrity, and the entire judiciary system of the United States will be burned to death. So, I currently strongly urge everyone to go against court packing. That's all of my video for today. If you do like it, please like, share, and subscribe. You can comment down below for your thoughts, and I'm signing off for today. Have a great day.